Okay, we do have, okay. It is on. All right. Well, welcome to our Bible class this morning. Time to begin. This is the last session in the summer session we had. But before we start that, I do want to thank everyone for the cards and prayers and visits during my unfortunate incarceration in the Camden Clark Hospital in mid-July. I appreciate all the concerns and prayers. It was an interesting experience. For those of you who don't know, I ended up having a blood clot in my left thigh, and I'd had a blood clot back in 2021, and I ended up at Parkersburg because they have a vascular group down there, and the surgeon said if we can get the clot cleared out, fairly quickly, you'll have no long-term effects. You'll be back to your original baseline like it never happened. And I thought, oh, it's great. So they ended up taking me into surgery the next day. They couldn't get the clot cleared. They used a catheter device like you do a heart catheterization. They tried to go through the clot with a wire and then try to drag it out, but they couldn't do that. So they ended up putting tubes in both the back of my legs and feed clot-busting drugs into the bottom of the clot from one leg and around the top, over and down, into the top of the clot from the other side, put me in ICU and let me lay there for 15 hours while all this stuff worked, and took me back into surgery the next day, and they were able to clear it out. So, boom, we're back to normal. It's like within a few days, it's like it never happened. It was really, really crazy. So I'm very appreciative of the vascular group at Camden Clark and the technology we have today to be able to do things like that. If this was back in the, I think warfarin, the drug that's normally a blood thinner, was developed in the early 1950s, and had this happened to me before the 50s, I probably would have been toast. And it's just kind of the way things went. But I'm still here, so that's good. So, and the other aspect is, I have this device now. I had the implant done at the end of June, and I got the device. They wait for that to heal up, and then I got the device a couple of weeks ago. And it's already, I can see that it helps at some things. Like I was mentioning, I'm a Reds fan, and I can actually listen to the Reds play-by-play, Bluetooth it to this thing, and I can actually understand it. That kind of blows me away that they can send an electrical signal to my brain, and it has any idea what that is. And they say over time, your brain is adaptable enough that it will begin to connect what you hear with what you see. So the idea is to, like audiobooks where you can read it and hear it at the same time over the course of several months, your brain will put those two things together to where it gets much better at recognizing speech. So I'm hopefully optimistic that will happen. So I'm thrilled. But anyway, back to that was kind of off the subject, but back to our class this morning. Like Michael began the class back in June, the very first session we had was based on Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiastes makes the point that anything that the world thinks is useful in the big picture doesn't offer fulfillment really at all. And there's been a lot of famous people, successful people, at least in the world's view, that have made comments like that. There's a comment from Marlon Brando in his biography that said, "I'm a middle-aged failure. I've tried everything. Sleeping around, drinking, working, none of them mean anything." And here's someone that's, a household name for us older people. Pierce Brosnan was another quote I liked. He said, "Fame is like a big piece of meringue. You keep eating it, but it doesn't fill you up." And none of us want to get to the end of our lives and say, I did all this work, made all these efforts, it really didn't amount to anything. What was the purpose of all this? So we want to make a difference in our lives. We want to have significance. And what is our purpose? And that's a question I think gets asked by teenagers and young people fairly often. And your worldview affects how you answer that question, or what direction you start off. And what your direction you start off really dictates where you end up. And I think I've mentioned it before in one of my Wednesday night devos, but there's this book called The Universe Next Door. Fascinating book. I've only read half of it because the rest of it was way over my head. But they actually use it in colleges and universities as a textbook for understanding worldviews. And it's written by a guy who was a Christian, and he goes through the different worldviews, kind of how they developed, and what the drawbacks are of the different ones. And just to give you a 30-second recap, it really does explain sort of where our society is headed. But before the 1600s and 1700s, almost exclusively the world had you call a theistic worldview, Christian theism, where everyone believed in God. They believed that God controlled the world and that he was worthy of worship. It was his word that gave us the moral standards for life. But as the technology began the scientific revolution and the age of reason, where everyone was thinking, well, we're not just have to follow God, we can think on our own, that really changed things. And it started in the 1700s, it became deism was a lot more popular. And deism is basically like Christian theism, except for they're the people that think God is still the creator. He started everything, but he was like the watchmaker that made the watch. He started the watch, he wound it up, he set it down, and he walked off. And he's not in charge anymore, and we got to figure this out ourselves. That's kind of what deism is. But it begins that shift where what I'm thinking is more important than what God says. So into the 1800s, it was deism. And then in the book, he explains how that kind of just naturally morphs into what they call naturalism. Naturalism is where, at that point, you've decided there is no God, and everything's up to us to figure out because matter is all there is. Human beings are just complex machines, and when we die, we go out of existence. There's no absolute right or wrong. Moral values are created by humans, and they're usually based on feelings, and that could be anything. And there's no overarching purpose in life. That sounds like a lot of thinking for a lot of younger people today. Maybe not younger people, but people in the last 50 to 100 years. And as bad as that sounds, it gets worse. That's what he says in the book. There's a growing one called nihilism, Nihilism, and it is worse. Existential nihilism says that human life has no intrinsic value. All values and meanings that humanity creates are meaningless. Humanity as a whole is without purpose or significance to the universe, and the universe is fundamentally chaotic, meaningless, and indifferent to us. That's pretty bad. Life has no meaning. Life has no value. I see so many times on the crime reports that people get murdered over $3. Life has no value to some people. It doesn't matter if you get killed. You think, like the war in Ukraine and Russia, it seems like the Russians have no concept of the value of their humans that they have thrown into this war, and it kind of blows my mind. And actually, this nihilism kind of got a good start in the late 1800s in Russia. They said it was one of the first places, and it gives you a very negative mindset about life. It's very depressing, very discouraging. It tends to be high rates of suicide when people think this way. And it kind of fits well into the Russian culture. They've been hammered by czars and evil leaders, and so maybe that's part of the way the mindset they have. I had an opportunity to go with my family to Russia in 2019 as a tourism before things went south over there. And I worked with a lady that was Russian in Pittsburgh, and she said, you can tell Americans because they smile. And she was right. No one in Russia smiles. They don't laugh. It's all serious. It's all sad. I think this whole mindset is part of that negativity that they have. But anyway, it seems like this is where the standard degradation of our mindset if you let God be taken out of the whole equation. So we're much better off staying back with Christian theism where life can have some meaning and there is a purpose because we understand God has a plan for us. It is difficult to have a purpose in your life when you think everything means nothing, right? So we do badly need the faith in God to correct this path. And that's the sad thing with him, taking God out of schools 30, 40, 50 years ago, and more of the kids are brought up where they have really no exposure to any kind of concept of God. it's for the long-term worldview, that is not a good thing. It really does have a huge impact. It's a very difficult thing to turn around. But back to our story. In 1983, Steve Jobs, he was the founder of Apple Computer, a pretty famous inventor. He'd started Apple, I think, in 76 or 77. It was like 3 people. And by 1983, it was a small fledgling company. They were really starting to come up with some stuff that was really interesting. They really weren't full-blown yet, but they had grown enough that they needed someone to be a day-to-day administrator for their business, because Jobs was an inventor. He wasn't really a day-to-day manager. And they were looking around, and there was a guy at Pepsi Corporation called John Scully who had worked his way up through Pepsi, and that was back in the Cola Wars days, and he had brought Pepsi way up to where they were competing successfully with Coke, and he'd gained a reputation for being a very good manager and very forward-looking. So Jobs had started working on trying to convince him to leave Pepsi and come to Apple. Well, here Scully is with a reputation. He's been with the company a good while. He's at the top of the heap. You know, he's kind of almost put on cruise control, probably finished his career. Why would he want to go to this Apple startup company? You know, at that point, they didn't have quite the reputation maybe they have now. So Jobs had approached him several times. Every time Scully would say, "Nah, not interested." But eventually, Jobs made the pitch that sealed the deal. He said, there's a pretty famous quote, "Do you want to sell sugar water the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Well, that must have resonated with Scully, because he finally said yes, and he went to Apple. And in a way, they did change the world, because Apple and the products they've developed, iPhones and iPods, iPads, and all that stuff, has really changed our technologies some. But in a different sense, though, God has called us as Christians to change the world. We're to be the salt and the light and try to attempt to teach the gospel to every living creature. So the question is, what foundation can we build upon to ensure that our lives are significant, and what is the foundation for finding a fulfilling life, and what makes a difference? And that's really the quest in the book of Ecclesiastes. I think it's a fascinating read. He spends the first 11 chapters in the book going through all the things that you can try, that most people try to find fulfillment today, and at the end, he rejects all of them. I think I was in college when I first sat down and read the book front to back. I think that was back in the 70s, and the NIV had just come out. I think the New Testament version came out in 75, 76, and the Old Testament came out a couple years later. And when that came out, Ecclesiastes is one of the things I sat down and just read through quickly. It's a good way to get a nice overview. If you haven't done that, I suggest giving it a try. But we go through the first 11 chapters. He evaluates everything. He says, none of that works. And in chapter 12, he gives us the conclusion from all these efforts to find the meaning of life. And he sums it up in just 13 verses. Many say the first 8 verses of chapter 12 are a masterpiece of literature. And I would have to agree. You have very vivid allegories of what it is to be of old age and coming death. And we have to remember, this is written to a young person. It wasn't written to people my age. We already know what that's like, or we're getting a taste of it anyway. But when we're young, we're so busy living life, there's not a tendency to think about these types of things unless we have someone older encouraging us. And this is where Solomon is using his wisdom to say to young people, here, you need to be thinking about this, because if you start early, it will make a difference. But he brings us home in a powerful way. I'll read the first 8 verses of chapter 12. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars were darkened, and the clouds return after the rain, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men are bent, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those who look through the windows are dimmed, and the doors from the street are shut, when the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. They are afraid also of what is high, and terrors are in the way. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails, because man is going to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. Before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. All is vanity. Okay, we'll go through this passage. He starts off by saying, remember the Creator in the days of your youth. And it's interesting that he uses the term Creator to refer to God, because first it reminds us that God, being the Creator, has unlimited power and knowledge. And he's also the creator of us, which means he knows us very well, and he had reasons for making man the way he has. And then lastly, that the creator is ultimately going to be man's judge one of these days, and that these things ought to be considered in the days of our youth. And again, young people are not inclined to think about these things. The next passage says, before the evil days come and the years draw near, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. As we get older, do the ravages of age make our life more difficult? I think everyone would agree to that. I'm starting to learn those lessons. And then in our final years, many times can be so filled with troubles and health concerns that life no longer brings the enjoyment that it used to. You know, my siblings get together every 6 months, and I'm the youngest of them. My sister's the oldest, she's 83. And now when we get together, all we do is talk about our doctor appointments. 20 years ago, that wasn't the case, but it is what it is. And I remember my mom had me when I was 40, when she was 40, and I think when I was probably 14, 15, she would have been in her mid-50s. She was talking to a group of other people her age, and I was kind of listening in. I was always fascinated to listen to their conversations, but the subject of death came up, and she said, you know, I don't really want to die, but if I did, I'm ready for that. I'm good with that. And as a 15-year-old, it's like, good night. That kind of blew me away. How could someone ever get to that point of view in their mind? And it stayed with me a long time, but eventually I can understand now how she got to that, because if you have lived your life in the way that you should, and you felt like you've accomplished and done the things you need to do, and you know that's ultimately going to happen, you kind of come to peace with the idea that, yes, this is the natural progression of life, and but when you're 15 years old, that's pretty far away from your mindset. That stuck with me for a good while. Back to our text. Verse 2, before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened. Commentators suggest that the light and the sun and the moon and the stars are always things associated with joy and the beauty of the heavens, and it represents our capacity for joy, and as they fade, our capacity for joy as we age tends to fade. And he mentions the clouds return after the rain. The clouds are normally considered to represent troubles. The rain is troubles. So once the rain glows, you expect blue sky. Well, blue sky doesn't come. The clouds are back. So it's one trouble after another. We see that sometimes. You know, like I've got my implant go on and I have my blood clots. It's like you don't have a chance to catch your breath. And I've got some years to go yet. Hopefully. We'll see. Verse 3, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men are bent, and arms and legs become weak, and when we're weak and we're trying to do something, we tremble. And more than a few of us become bent over as we age. Here's a blast from the past. Who remembers Jack LaLanne? Oh, I remember watching him on TV when I was probably back in the 60s. I was a little kid, and he was really gung-ho. They called him the godfather of fitness. That guy was... even when I read his obituary, he died in 2011, and that even when he was in his 90s, he would still get up and do a 2-hour routine every morning. He was very, very hardcore. But no matter how hardcore you are in trying to keep yourself fit and do everything exactly right, age is going to catch up with us. He sounded like he was quite a character. He said had heart surgery in the early 90s, and he said, I can't afford to die, it'll wreck my image. So he was quite the character. But regardless of what we do, it is going to catch up with us. The grinders cease because they are few. The teeth are missing. Of course, less a problem today with the dental care we have, so not as much of a problem. I would imagine back before dentistry became popular, that was very, very common. And those who look through the windows are dimmed. The eyes become dim. Cataracts and different eye diseases cause us a variety of problems. And the doors on the street are shut when the sound of the grinding is low. Again, hearing loss. I guess the grinding process was quite noisy. So if the grinding process was low, it got quieter. You just can't hear it anymore. And then one rises up at the sound of the bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. That's one irony of old age is, as we lose our hearing, we still get wakened up by the slightest little thing. So you get wakened up by a bird, even though you can't hear the grinders. And then the voice becomes weak. We can't sing like we used to. In verse 5, they are afraid of what is high and terrors in the way. As we age, we lose our sense of balance, and with weakness, it becomes more of a concern. One side effect of this implant is I have a low-grade dizziness now. The doctor thinks it might still go away, but it might be permanent. It might be one of those, as a trade, you get something, you have to give something up. And that's probably a pretty good deal to lose some balance to gain hearing. But as you lose your sense of balance, I'm less prone to want to get on a ladder right now. So falls become a greater danger. So even normal activities that used to be routine now can be a fearsome activity due to our age. And the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and the desire fails. Almond tree blossoms are white, by reference to our hair turning white, gray as we age, and the grasshopper drags himself along. Any self-respecting grasshopper can bing, 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 they go everywhere. So when the grasshopper has to drag himself along, it has changed a lot. When we're young, we bounce pretty well too, but as we age, we don't move like we used to. I'm much slower than I used to be. I remember when we were in Columbus, I was in my early 50s, and they had a softball team, and I thought, oh, I'll play softball. I hadn't tried to play softball in like 10, 15 years, and I got on base, and I started to run, and think, I'm trying to run, but I'm not running. It's just like everything is slow motion. It's just the way it goes. The whole passage is a very vivid description of old age. And these things will come to all of us if we're blessed to live long enough. And then medical assistance has actually made it so that we can survive some of the things that would maybe have done us in earlier, so there'll be more of us that see these effects. It says, then man is going to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. The inevitable end of all these problems are that we're destined to leave this world. And in verse 6, remember him before the silver cord is snapped, the golden bowl is broken, the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern. Solomon presents 4 metaphors concerning dying. The silver cord, silver of course being precious, but I don't imagine it makes a very good rope. It would seem to be quite fragile. The golden bowl, again, a value object that gets destroyed. The pitcher by the well shattered. Pitchers are used to draw water. Water is really a life-preserving substance that's necessary for us. And then the wheel broken at the cistern, probably the pulley used with a rope to draw water from the well that is crushed, maybe from wear and tear, or too weak to support the weight of the water. And then verse 7, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. As the creation account says, man was formed from dust. So Solomon says our body returns to where it came from, but it's interesting to note that he says the spirit returns to God. And many think this is one of the earlier veiled references to the afterlife, which is not detailed in the Old Testament, but is fully revealed in the gospel. As 2 Timothy 1:10 says, and now which has been manifest through the appearing of our Savior, Christ Jesus, who abolished death and brought life and immortality to light through the gospel. So the first verse of this section said, remember also the Creator in the days of your youth. So what does it mean to remember God? That seems like a pretty low bar. I remember God. I even read his book occasionally. I get much better than that. But Solomon gives us more detail of what he means in the final conclusion a few verses later in verse 13 when he says, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. He really condenses it down to fear God and keep his commandments. 6 words. Take an entire book, condense it down to 6 words. And that whole duty of man, the word duty really is not there in the original translation. It's really the whole of man. But to help us understand it better, they put duty in there. But it's really, or everything. A very well-known verse. So the question to me is, what does it mean to fear God? That doesn't sound like a pleasant thing. It doesn't sound like something we'd want to do. There's quite a bit of commentary on that, so I thought it was worth to dive into. The Hebrew word for fear occurs about 400 times in the Old Testament, 9 times in Ecclesiastes. And the most frequent definition of the word from Bible dictionaries is to be afraid, be feared, have reverence, be held in honor, worship, awe, alarm, and terror. And then one commentator made the following comment I thought was good. It said, in several passages, fearing and proper living are so closely related as to be virtually synonymous ideas. And he mentions passages in Leviticus, 2 Kings, and Deuteronomy. And it is plausible that this usage of to fear as a virtual synonym for righteous living or piety that grew out of viewing fear in any sense of the above as the motivation which produces righteous living. This practical, active fear is the kind of fear for which God rewarded the Egyptian midwives in Exodus 1:17 and 21. That's the passage where Pharaoh goes to, the Hebrews are having too many kids and they're getting too numerous, and he goes to the Egyptian midwives who helped the Hebrew women deliver their babies and said, when the babies are born, I want you to kill the males, but you can let the females live. And after a period of time, Pharaoh finds out that they're letting them all live. And he goes, and the Egyptian midwives feared God, and they said they refused to obey Pharaoh's order, and in order to obey God, they let the male babies live. And so the Pharaoh comes back later and says, why didn't you do what I said? Well, she said, the Hebrew ladies are very robust, and they have their babies before we get there, so we weren't there. But in verse 21, the scripture mentions that God rewarded those midwives because of their obedience. So, as they said, they feared God, but that prompted them to do the right thing. And by doing the right thing, they were pleasing to God. And this kind of fear was most appropriately learned by reading the law. We have a passage in Deuteronomy 31:11 and 12. It says, Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, at the set time in the year of release, at the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, and little ones, and the sojourner within your towns, that they may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, and be careful to do the words of the law, and that their children, who have not known it, may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, as long as you live in the land that you are going to the Jordan to possess. And then in the Truth for Today commentaries, which these red ones that are in the church library are excellent. I've always been impressed by what I find in those. They said that they make the point that many Bible scholars add the idea of reverence when discussing the Hebrew word for fear, and many believe it means more of respect. But they said really, in used relation to God, it does not carry the idea of respect, because Hebrew has their own separate word for respect. And they kind of wondered if many want to soften the meaning But in the past times, I mean, you go back 300 or 400 years ago, autocratic kingdoms were more of the common way governments were run. That meant you have a king or someone, a dictator who's in charge, and what he says goes. And I think if you lived in those times, you'd be acutely aware that you don't want to attract the king's negative attention. You don't want to get on his list where he's looking for you, because bad things can happen to you. So I think that kind of fear and respect and trying to do what the king says was more common than it is today. But they do exist in today's environment. I mean, like we're talking about Russia. If you publicly say something against Putin, especially if you're very outspoken, there's a good chance within the next month or two you're going to fall down some stairs or out a window someplace. They've had a crazy number of people who said things, and suddenly they have all these accidents and they die. It's amazing how that happens. I mean, North Korea is, I'm sure, even worse. You don't dare say anything there or you will be shot immediately. But in the U.S., we have no fear of our government leaders. In fact, we make fun of them pretty much daily, and they pretty much all deserve it. But maybe that keeps us from appreciating biblical fear, this whole concept, as much as we might. The Greek word for fear is where we get the word phobia. And if someone has a serious fear of heights, I think all of us to some extent have a little fear of heights. I mean, I can handle some height. You get me up high, I'm not that thrilled about it. But if you take any of us and stick us on one of these cell towers around here on top of it, even if you're tied off securely, I mean, most of us would be like, oh, this is not good. You can imagine that feeling of terror where you're so afraid you're afraid to move. And if you ever got down from there, you'd do everything you could not to ever get back in that position again. I think that's maybe more the concept. It's not that you need to have that fear, but once you understand that fear, then when you're on the ground, you're doing everything you can never to be in a position where you know what that fear would be like. So maybe that's a different way to look at it. But why is such fear required? Solomon tells us in Ecclesiastes 3:14, I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything be taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. So basically there are four features of God's work here. It's permanent, endures forever, it's complete, there's nothing to add to it, and there's no revisions, nothing to take away from it, and it's purposeful. God's purpose is to make men fear him, which produces righteous living. And we combine that with the thought in Romans 1:20, where Paul says, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So God's creation around us shows the power he has so that we should obey him, and we have no excuse if we do not. Again, another passage from the Truth to Today commentaries mentioned that one of the best passages to understand the use of the word fear is God's account of Moses and the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20:18-20. And it says, now when the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off and said to Moses, you speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us lest we die. And Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. So it's interesting. He says, do not fear, but yet the fear of the Lord will keep us from sinning. So it's more this idea of the respect for God creates this righteous living in us more than it is just being terrified. Being terrified in our lives is not a way to live. That'd be just consuming. If you're terrified of everything, that emotionally it would be very consuming. And I really am confident that's not what it means at all. But it's a confident assurance that we are doing the right things and doing the will of God by obeying him, and that he'll keep his promises, and all we have to do is do what we need to do, and everything will take care of itself. And this confident assurance is a very common theme in the New Testament. The faith chapter in Hebrews chapter 11 talks about this. Hebrews chapter 6 mentions a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. We have songs like A Blessed Assurance, that we know Jesus is on our side and he constantly washes away our sin, 1 John 1:7, when we walk in the light. So I think it's important to balance those two sides. We don't want to go too much toward living in fear, because that's consuming and not really, I think, what was meant. But yet, if there isn't enough respect and fear, it doesn't drive us to do the things that we need to do to be pleasing to God. So it's a balancing act. And in life, most things are a balancing act. You can do one, but you can't do both at the same time. So the title of this lesson was Living Expeditiously. And expeditiously is not a term I use very often in daily conversation, but the dictionary shows it's prompt efficiency. Of course, to be efficient means there's limited waste of time or effort, and prompt means it's quickly. It has to speed to achieve a task. So in the context of Ecclesiastes, it means that we need to focus on making God a priority in our lives and doing it quickly and efficiently, starting when we're young, as Solomon advises. And that increases the chances that as we live, we'll make wise decisions, build a foundation through our lives, and it helps us to be more prosperous and beneficial to God and to the people around us. Proverbs 22:6 comes to mind. Train up a child in the way that he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. And the odds of a person later in life who never was exposed to teaching about God, becoming obedient to God, is pretty low. I don't give up on the possibility of someone becoming a Christian later in life, but we can see the benefit in the statistics that those who are taught when they're young, a much higher probability of maintaining that through their lives. So regardless of where we are in our lives, we need to put a priority on remembering God, as Romans 12:1 says, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. If we do that, we should have fulfillment in our lives, and we should be on positive influence on those around us, and we should achieve the goal in heaven when we leave this world. So, thank you. I've class for the day. I really would like to have had some discussion and questions, but I have no chance of hearing anyone who says anything that would make me kind of feel bad to not be able to reply. But maybe in 6 months I'll be better at that. So we shall see. But appreciate your attention this morning, and thank you.